You ever stop and wonder, why can't a president or a king just do whatever they want? Well, the answer to that question, funny enough, starts with one of the absolute worst kings in history. A guy so bad, he was forced to sign one of the most important documents the world has ever seen, the Magna Carta. It's a huge question, isn't it? What is it that actually stops a leader from having total unchecked power? For a huge part of the world, the story of how we answered that question really starts to get hammered out more than 800 years ago in England. That's right. The incredible idea that nobody is above the law didn't come from some brilliant, enlightened ruler. Oh no, it was forced on a king who was so greedy and so incompetent that his own nobles finally had enough and rose up against him. So, to really get how things got that bad, we need to jump in our time machine. Our story actually kicks off more than a century before the Magna Carta. It starts with a single event that would completely change England and concentrate an unbelievable amount of power in the hands of the king. And that event was the Norman Conquest. The year 1066. Talk about a whirlwind. The English king dies without an heir. So William, the super powerful Duke of Normandy over in France, sees his chance. He invades, wins the decisive Battle of Hastings, and boom, by Christmas Day he's being crowned King of England. Just like that, a French duke was now the English king. Now, William was no fool. He had a brilliant strategy for locking down his new kingdom. He grabbed all the land from the English who fought against him and gave it to his loyal followers. But, and this is key, he was careful to scatter their new estates all over the country so no single lord could get too powerful. And then, the masterstroke. He made every single landowner, big or small, swear loyalty directly to him, the king. This gave him a level of centralized control the King of France could only dream of. And this Norman influence wasn't just political. They literally reshaped the country. They brought their culture, their language, and their architects. They built these huge, imposing stone castles and cathedrals everywhere. It was a constant, physical reminder to everyone every single day of exactly who was in charge now. So let's fast forward a bit. William's descendants, a dynasty called the Plantagenets, they inherited this powerful English kingdom. But they also still controlled a massive empire back in France. And this created a really complicated and frankly unstable situation. I mean, just take a look at this. Under King Henry II, the English crown controlled a huge chunk of France. We're talking more territory in France than the French king himself. You can just imagine how the King of France felt about having this powerful rival sitting right on his doorstep, controlling half his country. And here is where things get really weird. This is the central paradox. See, in England, the Plantagenet kings were sovereign rulers. They answered to nobody. But for all their lands in France, they were technically vassals of the French king. They were supposed to bow down to him. So how can you be a supreme king one minute and a subordinate duke the next? It's an impossible situation, right? Conflict was pretty much guaranteed. And the man who was about to bring this entire teetering house of cards crashing down was King John, a man who historians have called, and I'm quoting here, the most despicable of English kings. Ouch. John's reign was just a masterclass in failure. First, through a combination of arrogance and incompetence, he lost almost all of those valuable French lands. Then he got into a massive fight with the Pope, one of the most powerful men in the world, and got himself excommunicated. All church services in England were shut down because of him. And finally, to fund his failed wars, he taxed his barons into the ground until they just couldn't take it anymore. They were ready for rebellion. So now, King John is weak, he's defeated, and pretty much everyone in his kingdom hates him. He was completely cornered. And in 1215, his rebellious barons marched, not to kill him or replace him, but to force him to accept a truly revolutionary idea, that even a king has to follow the rules. And what they came up with was the Magna Carta, which is just Latin for Great Charter. You can think of it like a contract. It was a list of all the things that by Old English custom the king simply wasn't allowed to do. For the very first time, it was put down in writing that a king's power had limits, and those limits were the law. And this clause here, this is the most famous one of all. It establishes what we now call due process. The king can't just throw you in jail because he feels like it. You have a right to a proper trial by your equals. This was an absolutely game-changing idea, the tiny seed that would eventually grow into huge rights like trial by jury. And to get a sense of just how radical this was, you just have to look across the channel to France. For nearly 600 more years, all the way to their own revolution in 1789, the French king could have anyone arrested and locked up forever, without a trial, without even giving a reason. The Magna Carta set England on a totally different course.
Okay, but let's pause for a reality check. When the charter says freemen, who are we actually talking about? Well, not most people, not even close. Freemen, the nobles, the clergy, some merchants, they were a tiny minority of the population. The vast majority of people were serfs, basically peasants tied to the land, and they had none of these protections. Let's be honest, the barons were mainly looking out for themselves.
So why do we care so much about it today? Because even though it only applied to a few people at first, the Magna Carta established a principle. It put the idea of the rule of law down on paper. It was like planting a flag. It became this foundational document that future generations could point to and say, see, the ruler is not all powerful. It became a shield against tyranny. And that brings us to the final, really crucial question, doesn't it? If this all started as a self-serving deal for a handful of rich nobles, how on earth did its ideas grow into the universal human rights that so many of us believe in today? Well, the long, winding journey of that single, powerful idea is one of the most important stories in the history of freedom.